really interesting area of language use is language use and gender. And obviously this topic generates a lot of interesting debate. It's the source of a lot of comedy, and can actually create some tension if you get too involved in the debate. But it is, as language teachers, a really interesting area for us to look at. And with our advanced level students, we can actually get into some of this information with our students so that they can refine both their understanding of the language and their use of the language. We'll start by taking a look at different definitions of gender. It's not quite as easy a term to define as you might think, and our definitions or conceptualization of gender have evolved over time, so we'll take a look at this evolution. Then we'll take a look at the relationship between gender and language use. Is there a relationship, and if yes, what is the nature of that relationship? Then we'll discuss how language is used to talk about men and women. Is this language used the same or different? And then we'll look at how men and women use language themselves. So let's get started taking a look at this really, really interesting topic of language use and gender. On the surface, or at first glance, the definition of gender might seem pretty simple. There are males and there are females, and this is true of every species that exists. However, it's not quite as clear-cut. So we can kind of divide studies in gender into three main areas. So we've got academics looking at the biology of gender, so the different chromosomes and so on that make the different genders. Then we've got researchers taking a look at the socialization aspects of gender. So does a society create men in a certain way and women in a certain way? And then a really new area in gender studies has come to the forefront, and this is the idea that gender is actually individually constructed, both as a combination of biology, socialization, and then individual experience and individual uniqueness. So there's kind of three perspectives that we can take on the definition of gender when we start to dig below the surface of the classic definition of male and female. For a very long time, researchers looking on the biology side of gender believed very firmly that there was a male brain and a female brain, and that these two brains had very different structures and therefore created very different outputs and also had very different capabilities. So there was this whole science that built up around the idea that men have bigger brains. They do actually, physically in terms of size, the male brains are bigger on average, and therefore they have greater capability intellectually. And because female brains are smaller, they have less capability intellectually. This is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to direct you to a great video on YouTube, and you'll see this on your handout, and you can see a researcher in this area kind of digging into all of the mythology about the biology at the brain level and in terms of gender differences between males and females. So it's a great video, so take the opportunity to take a look at that right now. So on the biology side of things, there's a lot of really interesting debate going on, as you've seen from that video. And as I said, I am not an expert in this area, but if it is of interest, dig deeper into it. It's quite fascinating stuff. And then on the other hand, there's also a lot of research into the socialization of gender. So each society or each culture trains men and women to behave a specific way. So there's an overall belief in some societies, for example, that men are socialized to behave more aggressively and women are socialized to behave more passively and so on. And you can see socialization at work when you look at the gender roles and the gender behaviors that you see from one cultural group to another. So there is a lot of weight to the argument that there's a whole socialization element to gender. Once again, I'm not an expert in this, so if it's an area that you are interested in, by all means dig deeper into it. And then finally, the most current research on gender studies really focuses on each individual constructing his or her own perception of his or her own gender, and then making choices about how to portray that to the world. So gender is being very closely tied with identity and in identity construction and so on. So that each individual is viewed as a very unique manifestation of a combination of biology, socialization, and then unique personal experience and unique genetic makeup. So this is also a very fascinating way to look at gender. Just for the simplicity of taking a look at this issue of language use and gender, we're going to go back to just the idea that there is male and there's female. And we're not doing this because we're disregarding all of the other variations of how humans experience their genderness. We're simply doing that to really focus on the fun we can have when we look at language use and gender. So we're just going to simplify things a little bit, acknowledging that it is a simplification and that there's a lot more complexity out there. So when it comes to language use and gender, we can kind of divide our study or our exploration into two main areas. First, we'll take a look at language used to talk about men and women, and then we'll take a look at how men and women use language. So when we dig into how language is used to talk about men and women, or male and female, we can divide it into three main categories. So we can look at the vocabulary that's used to talk about men and women. We can see if there's any grammatical structures or grammatical differences in terms of how men and women are talked about. And finally, we can take a look at any differences in terms of discourse patterns that are used to talk about men and women. When it comes to vocabulary that is used to talk about men and women, there's a number of smaller categories that we need to look at. So we need to look at insult terms that are used. We need to look at a concept called symmetry and then its opposite, asymmetry. We need to look at titles that are used for men and women. We need to look at something called unmarked and marked terms. And finally, we need to take a look at something called semantic derogation. To take a look at insult terms, I'm going to put you to work. What I'd like you to do is just make a chart on a piece of paper or use your handout and write down insult terms that are used for men, insult terms that are used for women, and insult terms that are used for both, so both men and women. So first of all, take a few minutes to brainstorm that and then come on back to the video. I'm actually not going to give you a list of insult terms that are used for men and women because I don't want this video to be R-rated or anything like that. But what I do want you to do is take a look at the lists of words that you've come up with. So the insult terms for men, the insult terms for women, and the insult terms for both. And you should see a couple of trends start to emerge. You should see that for men, a lot of the insults go after things like their intellectual capability, their physical strength, and their masculinity. Okay? And then if you look at the insult terms for women, you'll notice that a lot of these are very sexualized. So insult terms for women tend to be more about their sexuality. And then insults for both obviously are just more generic. But so take a look at the lists of insults you've come up with and see if you can see that trend emerge. Next we have the concept of symmetry and asymmetry. Symmetry simply means that if we've got two terms, one for males of a species and one for females, they both get equal usage and they have equal scope of use. The opposite is asymmetry, where those two terms don't get equal usage and don't have equal scope of use. So we can see this with some examples on your handout. When we look at the words in English for horses, so the species of horses, we see symmetry in action, not asymmetry, but symmetry. So we have a generic term for horse that is used both for male and female. Then we have an adult male term, an adult female term. We have a generic young animal term. And then we have a young male term and a young female term. And these all have equal scope of use. However, when we look at words in English for human beings, we see some asymmetry happening. So we have the generic term human or human being, and then we have the adult term man, the adult term woman, and then we have the child term boy and the child term girl. However, and the generic term children, which is used for a lot of different species, but we see a different scope of use for the adult term man. Not so much today. This is actually a change that's going on in the language right now. But over the long history of English, the term man was also used to generically talk about human beings as a whole. So we see some asymmetry of use there between woman, which is used only for adult females, and then man, which is used for adult male and human beings generically. So this is the concept of symmetry and asymmetry. Next, we'll take a look at titles that are used in English for men and women. And here we see some differences as well. So for men, the title that we put in front of a male name is Mr. Okay? However, we see different usage when it comes to women because we've got 3 title choices. We've got Miss, Mrs., and Ms. And the Miss and Mrs. are used to indicate marital status. So obviously, a female using the title Miss is not married, a female using the title Mrs. is married, and then Ms. is the term that's used as a title for all women. So we see a difference here that titles for women differentiate marital status, whereas the one title for men doesn't differentiate on that marital status. And then we have generic terms such as doctor, judge, and president, and so on, that are used equally for men and women. So it's kind of interesting when you see the title usage, you see this difference in terms of how men and women are talked about with our language use. The next way that we talk about men and women differently, or that we can talk about men and women differently when it comes to vocabulary, is this concept of unmarked versus marked terms. So unmarked terms are terms that don't have a specific ending that indicates that this word is only used to talk about men or only used to talk about women. A marked term, on the other hand, has an ending on it that indicates it's only used to talk about men or women, and generally marked terms are used for talking about women, not men. So we've got some examples for you, and we'll work through these examples so you can see this idea of unmarked versus marked terms. Here are some examples. We've got the word prince for male and princess for female. And these are exclusively used for male and female, so these are not considered either marked or unmarked. The same is true for count for male and countess for female, and another example, duke for male and duchess for female. These are neither marked nor unmarked. However, when we get into terms like waiter and waitress, this is when we see unmarked and marked come into play. So a waiter can be used for the male or female person who does this occupation, whereas a waitress is marked exclusively for female. An actor is unmarked, actress is marked for female, host is the unmarked, and hostess is marked for female. Another example is comedian, which is unmarked, comedienne, which is the marked for female version, and then usher, unmarked, usherette is marked for female. Unmarked and marked are slightly different than the idea of symmetry and asymmetry. So in symmetry and asymmetry, the word for the male version of something and the female version is completely different. It's a totally separate word. When it comes to unmarked and marked, however, we keep the same base word and then we just mark it as either male or female, usually female, by the ending or the suffix that we put on the word. So we put ESS, for example, on actor to get actress, and that marks it as the female version of the word. An interesting thing is starting to happen with these unmarked versus marked terms, and that is more and more women are actually choosing to be referred to by the unmarked version. So instead of calling myself an actress, I'm not, by the way, but if I were, I wouldn't call myself an actress, I would call myself an actor. So I'm very consciously choosing to have the unmarked term used to refer to me. So slowly over time, we're seeing the marked versions kind of go out of style as women are very consciously choosing not to have that marked term applied to them. And the final piece with vocabulary when it comes to language we use to talk about men and women is the concept of semantic derogation. Semantic derogation means that a word takes on a negative connotation or is given a negative connotation in some situations, and therefore it loses its value. So instead of having a positive feel-good meaning to it or sense to it, it takes on a negative sense to it. So here are some examples of semantic derogation that have been applied to vocabulary items used to talk about usually mostly women. So here are some examples. When we're talking about men, we use the term gentleman, And when we're talking about women, the corresponding term is lady. However, lady has taken on some negative connotations in certain situations. So, for example, we have the term lady of the night to indicate a prostitute. We have cleaning lady, which is indicating someone who obviously cleans your house and has a lower status often in society or in the economic hierarchy. So the term lady can have a negative connotation, whereas the term gentleman generally doesn't have any negative connotations associated with it. We see some semantic derogation with the term girl as opposed to the term boy that is used for males. So girl is often used to refer to full-grown women, and it's used because it kind of indicates they're not quite fully mature, or they don't quite have the authority or the status that a man correspondingly would have. So we often hear the word man being used for the men and girl being used for the women. So there's a bit of semantic derogation going on with the word girl. Some people would argue that there's similar semantic derogation happening with the word boy. If we use the word boy to refer to a mature male, for example, we're once again taking that person down in status, either socioeconomic status or just power status. So we see a little bit of semantic derogation in both the male and female terms, but definitely more on the female side. And a final example of semantic derogation comes with the pair of words bachelor and spinster. So bachelor is used to describe single men, and spinster is used to describe single women. There's a much stronger negative connotation associated with the word spinster. So you imagine somebody who's kind of withered inside and very old and not considered successful, possibly eccentric. These are the cat ladies that come to mind. So the word spinster really conjures up in people's minds a fairly negative connotation. Bachelor, on the other hand, doesn't really have a lot of negative connotation associated with it. And then there's the corresponding term bachelorette that can also be paired with bachelor. There's not quite as much negative connotation associated with the idea, with the concept or the word bachelorette. It's more considered a little bit younger, less mature, but it doesn't have that strong negativity that the word spinster has. So these are examples of semantic derogation. Grammar in English presents us with an interesting challenge when it comes to the language that we use to talk about men and women. In English, we've got two different third-person pronouns, and one of them is used to talk about men, and one of them is used to talk about women. So we use he to talk about men and she to talk about women. This becomes challenging when we're talking about human beings generically or generally. So what term, if I want to speak about a teacher and I want to talk about all teachers generally, what term do I choose? Do I choose the pronoun he? Do I choose the pronoun she? Do I do a he-she combination? Or do I make it plural, teachers, and then I can use the pronoun they? So this is an interesting dilemma that is specific to English and other languages that have gender-specific pronouns in the third person. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of this. Here are some examples all using the profession of teaching, so being a teacher. So a teacher should create a lesson plan for his lessons. If he does, he will be prepared and organized. So in this sentence, I've chosen to use the male pronoun he. And the connotation that comes with this, or the idea that comes with this, is that teachers are generally male. Okay? There may be some female teachers in there, but they're in the minority. I have another option. A teacher should create a lesson plan for her lessons. If he, she does, he, she will be prepared and organized. So if I make this choice in terms of my pronouns, where I'm including both the male and the female third-person pronouns, I'm saying that both men and women are teachers and they're pretty much equally represented. So I want to do justice to the situation and mention both men and women. Or I've got another choice. I can turn it into a plural situation so that I don't have to deal with this third-person singular issue at all. So teachers should create a lesson plan for their lessons. If they do, they will be prepared and organized. So instead of having to choose he or she, I've flipped the situation into a plural, and therefore I can just use the generic they, which does not indicate male or female. If you go back in time, even 20 or 30 years, you'll see that a lot of texts select the he option. So they select to use the male pronoun he in these types of situations. This has changed over time recently, however, because women have gained more socioeconomic power, and seeing the pronoun he referring to professions that women are heavily present in is just not acceptable. The he-she option, so he/she, while it's probably the most accurate option, it's not really, it doesn't flow smoothly and it looks a little bit awkward. So a lot of people don't like that option. The option of turning the situation into a plural situation where we can use they is the most grammatically correct and the most politically correct option to take when it comes to dealing with this he-she option. You'll see some people choosing a grammatically incorrect option, however, that makes grammar teachers kind of cringe. So, for example, I could say a teacher has to put a lot of work into planning their lesson plans. So instead of choosing he or she with my singular, I use a plural pronoun, which is grammatically incorrect, but it is politically correct because it gets rid of this he-she issue. So you'll see some grammatically incorrect choices that people make, but you can understand why they're making it. They're trying to get away from this he-she choice that our third-person pronoun system presents us with. Really interesting stuff happens when we talk about men and women at the discourse level. We can separate discourse about men and women into two categories. One category strictly deals with the text or the words that are strung together to talk about men and women. And then the other category is what we call multimodal communication. And this is a combination of both text and words or moving pictures that are used to communicate about men and women. And as multimedia gains more and more traction in our society, we see more and more multimodal communication in terms of discourse than we see text-only communication. So at the discourse level, we want to look at how our men talked about and how our women talked about, both in text-only and in multimodal communication. So we'll have a little bit of fun and take a look at some examples that go back in time quite a bit, and then we'll bring it up to more recent times. But you can sort of see the ideas or the images that are communicated about men and women at the discourse level through these examples. So the first example goes way, way back in time, and it's an advertisement for a washing machine for women. And so the text is, "Be a real Santa Claus to the wife." So if you're female and you're watching this, you're probably cringing just looking at this, or you're laughing because you have to take some of this stuff with a hint of humor. But we've got this image that it is the male that is going to present the female with this gift, and the female is just categorized as the wife. And if you want to be a good husband to the wife, then you'd better purchase her this particular machine. Discourse about women changed fairly significantly during World War II because women were needed in the factories and as auxiliary support in the armed forces in order to support the war effort. So women were portrayed as being very strong and powerful in the discourse in this time frame. So we see even with household advertising or advertising for household goods, for example, we've got a very strong and powerful woman being portrayed here. So get the power to clean anything. The discourse about women here is that women are very powerful and therefore have a big contribution to make to society. The next advertisement comes from after the war, and women were once again put back into households as the wives. And so gone is this powerful portrayal of women, and back is this idea of women as the wife. So we've got a lot of discourse about women as housekeepers, and they're the target of housekeeping goods and services, for example. This next one's kind of entertaining, first of all, from the fact that we've got a doctor promoting cigarette smoking. That tells you how far we've come in terms of our science about cigarette smoking. They used to use doctors to promote it as a relaxation tool, for example, or a de-stressor. But the interesting discourse thing about men and women here is that, the doctor is a man, and it's an older man, and that is the person who is being established as the expert in this particular piece of discourse. This next advertisement, I believe, comes from either the late 60s or the early 70s, and we see the very clear discourse about men and women here. The man is portrayed as the breadwinner who earns money to buy household gadgets for the wife, and these gadgets do everything except cook because that's what the wife is for. It is fun to go back in time and see the discourse about men and women and see how it's changed over time, and thank goodness it has changed over time. You can also see a lot of this discourse about men and women, particularly at the multimodal level, in TV advertisements and now internet-based advertisements. So just have some fun, go on YouTube or Google different video advertisements for household cleaning products, for example, or gadgets or tools, and just take a look at the discourse about men and women that's being conveyed or communicated through those particular advertisements. So you'll look at these with a really sharp eye and you'll see some interesting messages about men and women being communicated through these advertisements. Back at the beginning of this session, I mentioned that there's kind of two ways we need to approach language and gender. One way is looking at the language that is used to talk about men and women. And then the second way is how men and women themselves use language. So we've finished the section on how language is used to talk about men and women, and we're going to move on to how men and women themselves use language, and are there any differences in this language use. If you look at TV shows and films, particularly comedy, you can pretty clearly see exaggerations of how men and women use language. So we've given you two short clips to take a look at on your handout, so put these into your computer and take a look at these clips and really be conscious of kind of what ideas about how women use language and how men use language are being conveyed with these particular clips. Creators of entertainment have a lot of fun with this idea of men and women using language quite differently and exaggerating that language use for comedy purposes, for example, or dramatic purposes. But researchers have had kind of a different perspective on this, and a lot of the research on how men use language versus how women use language is actually inconclusive. So some studies say there are very significant differences in language use, and other studies say, no, there's actually no significant differences. So I'll take you through some of the research and what it says, and then at the end of this, it's really up to you to make up your mind about whether men and women do actually use language differently. There are 5 main areas that have been the focus of research to address this question of whether men and women use language differently. And I should clarify that this research has been done with the English language. So looking at these issues for other languages is a completely different set of research, and it would be a fascinating set of research to compare male and female language use in different languages as well. But this research does focus on the English language. So the first area of research is verbosity. So researchers are looking at whether men and women simply speak the same amount. So do women speak more than men, or men speak more than women, or there's no difference. The next area of research is called turn-taking. So do men and women navigate a conversation differently and have different strategies for allowing a listener to then become a speaker and vice versa? The next area of research is back-channel support. Back-channel support is simply how much a listener encourages a speaker to keep going by using things like really, oh, interesting. So back-channel support is how a listener supports a speaker, and do men and women do that differently? The next area of research is called mitigating. Mitigating is when we use different language use strategies to either strengthen but usually weaken the power of what we're saying. So I might do something like hedge or hesitate. I might use uncertainty words in order to mitigate or decrease the strength of what I'm saying. And the final area of research is the use of a rising intonation. So it's an area of research focused on pronunciation. And rising intonation has been identified by some researchers as a female language use feature in order to, and it's used, they think, by women to decrease, once again, the strength of what they're saying. So these are the 5 areas of research when it comes to this question of, do men and women use language differently? So let's take a quick look at the research on verbosity. So verbosity is asking the question, Do men speak more than women, or women speak more than men? So who speaks more? Who generates more speech? And the research on this really is quite divided, and it's very inconclusive. So there have been some studies that have concluded that, yes, women are more verbose than men, and other studies have concluded the exact opposite. And what's really interesting here, however, is that it does seem to come down to context. So in certain situations, it appears that women might speak more. And in other situations, it appears that men might speak more. And when we dig deeper into these situations, it comes down to a lot of power dynamics. So a person having more power in a particular situation will probably speak more, and a person having less power in a situation will probably speak less. So the question of verbosity in terms of male and female language use really is inconclusive, and there's this whole power dynamic and situational dynamic that kind of clouds the water. We see the same lack of clarity in the research when it comes to turn taking and interrupting. So intuitively you might think, okay, women take turns more frequently or interrupt more frequently, or men take turns more frequently or interrupt more frequently, depending on your perspective and yourself as a communicator. And the research really says that we can't say one way or the other. And it's exactly the same reason that we've got the same cloudiness when it comes to verbosity. It does appear to be very situation specific. So in certain situations, it appears that women will take turn more frequently and interrupt more frequently. And in other situations, it's the men who do that. And once again, similar to the issue of verbosity, it really does seem to be a question of power dynamics. And then we've also got clouding both of these, actually, both verbosity and turn-taking, we've got the issue of personality. Some people are just more talkative than other people, and it doesn't really come down to male versus female, but it just comes down to this person likes to talk and this other person doesn't. So the research, once again, is pretty inconclusive here. Back-channel support is all about whether a listener supports the speaker, either through active listening strategies or through things like eye contact and posture and facial expression. So back-channel support means that as the listener, I'm encouraging the speaker to keep going and to keep speaking. So I might say things like, really? Oh, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Or I might ask questions, particularly open-ended questions, to get the speaker to keep going. Or I might have an interested facial expression on my face, or I might be leaning into the conversation. These are all ways to provide back-channel support. The research seems to show that there's a little bit more use of back-channel support by women and a little bit less than by men, but the difference is not really significant, and it's certainly not a big enough difference for us to say very definitively that women provide more back-channel support than men. So a little bit more clarity here than with verbosity and turn-taking, but still not a lot. The next area of language that researchers focus on in order to answer this question, do men and women use language differently, is the area of mitigating. So mitigating is a series of strategies and sets of words that we use in order to decrease the power of what we're saying. So we don't want to come across too forcefully, and therefore we mitigate what we say. There are three main strategies that we have, or tools at our disposal, in order to decrease the forcefulness of what we say. The first set of tools we have are tools for hedging. So hedging is doing things like sort of, kind of, so anything that's putting some hesitating in there. This dilutes the forcefulness of what we say. Another strategy is the use of modals, or more specifically epistemic modals. So these are words like should, could, might, may, and when we add these to our idea, we back off on the forcefulness once again of that idea. And then there are other words that we can use, such as possibly, probably, that also mitigate the strength of what we're saying. So these are strategies that we can use, and researchers look at who uses these strategies more, men or women. And once again, I hate to say it, the research on mitigation differences between men and women is mixed, and there's not really anything we can say with any degree of certainty. So in some studies, it looks like women mitigate more. In other studies, it looks like men do so. But what really comes to the foreground once again in these studies is that it is very much an issue of power. So if we don't have a lot of power in a situation, we tend to use mitigating more. And if we have more power in a situation and it's okay for us to be more forceful, then we're going to mitigate actually less. So the research seems to say it's more a power issue than a gender issue. And power shifts once again depending on the situation. So there's a lot of stuff happening here that kind of clouds our ability to say very clearly yes or no. Men and women use mitigating strategies differently. One area of research in language use differences between men and women that has yielded really clear results is research into the use of rising intonation. Rising intonation in English, when we use it with a statement, adds a questioning tone or a degree of uncertainty to the statement. So, for example, if I say, I'm going out tonight, I sound certain. But if I put a rising intonation, I'm going out tonight, there's a questioning and a level of uncertainty there. And so researchers have looked at the use of rising intonation with statements specifically in order to determine if men or women use this rising intonation more frequently. And the research is very clear here. The use of rising intonation with statements to either put a questioning tone in there or a degree of uncertainty is much, much more frequently used by females than males. And there's also a generational piece in here. It's very frequently used by female teenagers. So they're kind of at the cutting edge of the use of rising intonation with statements. So this is one piece of research that very clearly demonstrates a difference in language use between men and women, and that is the use of rising intonation with statements. There's another extensive study in terms of the differences of language use between men and women that's worth mentioning here. And this is a study by Newman et al. And what this study looked to do was to take texts generated by men and texts generated by women and analyze them on a word basis and just see if there were actual differences in the number of words used, the types of words used, and the topics of the words used, and so on. And in this study, they did determine a fairly clear difference in terms of the topics that men and women seem to talk about. So I'll just go over the differences in topics and content that this study revealed. So in this study, in terms of content and topic, the women generally appeared to talk more about people, more about emotions, and more about internal processes and thought processes. On the other hand, the men in this study seemed to talk more about external events and a lot about things that you might typically associate with male conversation, sports, and things like that. So there was a fairly clear difference in this study between the content of female language and the content of male language. Interestingly, in this study, there were also several content areas and word type areas where there was no difference between the language used by men and the language used by women. The researchers had sort of expected to see more emotional content on the negative side, such as anger and frustration, coming from men than women, but they didn't see that actually. And then they also had expected to see a little bit more verbosity from women than men, and they didn't see that either. So the study revealed some differences between content between men and women, and in some situations there were no differences revealed at all. There are a lot of limitations to this research on trying to pinpoint any differences between how men use language and how women use language. And here are some of them. So there are limitations in terms of the number of participants. So most of these studies did not use a large number of participants simply because this generates a huge amount of data to work with. So there's a limitation there. We're just looking at a smaller number of people. There are also limitations in terms of differences among the people being studied, such as age differences, regional differences, and occupation or profession differences. Then there are issues also of context. So we talked about some of the studies that were not conclusive, and they were not conclusive because the context of language use was quite different. So when we change the context, we very often change the power structure of the communication that takes place, and this limits the conclusions that we can make about language use. There are also challenges when it comes to actually analyzing the data that we get from these types of studies. So for example, in the last study, the Newman et al. Study, they were actually counting words, and it comes down to the question of, well, what constitutes a word? Okay, and so am I going to count this or am I not? And then categorizing words. What are my categories, and Am I going to put this word in this category, or does it belong in this category? So there's a lot of limitations out there that we need to kind of factor in as we're interpreting the data generated by these language use studies. As you've hopefully realized from this quick look at the different research that's been conducted on how men and women use language, we really don't know with any degree of certainty whether we can pin down specific language use patterns and say, okay, this is what men do and this is what women do. The only one that we can do that with any degree of certainty with is the rising intonation. But it's still a lot of fun to consider the question. So do have some fun with this and take a look at how you use language, whether you're male or female. Listen to how your friends and family members use language and see if you can identify any differences between male and female language use. So it's a really fun topic to take a look at. As I mentioned, all of the research that I've talked about has been focused on the English language. And the English language doesn't have a lot of clarity in terms of how men use language versus how women use language. So we don't have any systematic way that gender differences in terms of language use are put into place in our language. But there are languages that do actually have very clear dividing lines between how men use the language and how women use the language. One good example of this is the Japanese language. Okay? I am by no means an expert on the Japanese language, but I am aware of the gender differences in some aspects of Japanese language usage, in that there are certain structures that men use and certain structures that women use. So there's kind of like a male dialect of Japanese and a female dialect of Japanese. There are three very clear grammatical patterns to Japanese that differentiate male Japanese versus female Japanese. One is the way sentences are ended. So statements are ended in one particular way if you're male and in another particular way if you're female. And then we get the same ending difference with questions. So men will use one grammatical structure to end questions or indicate a question, and women will use another grammatical structure to indicate a question. And then the final difference, really clear difference anyway, between male Japanese and female Japanese is in the use of the pronouns you and I. So there is one pronoun that men use and another pronoun that women use. So these are some fun differences to take a look at, and if you are a Japanese speaker yourself or you know any Japanese speakers, take a bit of time to quiz them about these differences. They're really interesting. Japanese is by no means the only language that has very clear grammatical patterns that are assigned to male language use and female language use. So if you know other languages, and obviously I'm sure you do, take a look at those languages and ask the question, do men use the language differently than women? And are there clear grammatical patterns or clear vocabulary patterns or clear pronunciation patterns that are associated with male use of the language versus female use of the language? Once again, it's a really interesting avenue of inquiry. And there's one other avenue of inquiry that I want to point you in when it comes to language use and gender. Way back at the beginning of this session, I mentioned that I was really simplifying the concept of gender in order to look at language use. So we simplified gender to male and female. But that obviously disregards all of the other options that exist between this male-female continuum, or the two sides of the continuum. And depending on where people fall on that continuum, they may or may not make different language use choices. So, for example, do male homosexuals have certain language use choices? Or do female homosexuals have certain language use choices? Or do transgender individuals have certain language use choices? So when we start to add the complexity of this whole definition of both gender and gender preference and gender identity, we get a whole different set of areas of language use to explore. So this is a really, really fun area of language to look at, and I completely encourage you to add that complexity back in and take a look at language use and gender in a lot more detail.